Okay, so we have a smart object that's actually just the snail with a mask. We see that it's the smart snail here. He's got a mask and he has the snail, and that's about it. And then we have the snail itself with the mask as a standard layer. So what makes these smart objects so great? I keep saying that they're fantastic. Well, because there is an entire document behind this layer, it can be re-referenced after you've done a destructive transformation, and it can return it to its original state. So what does that mean? That's just a lot of random words, right? Let's say I just do Control T. That's the same thing as edit free transform. And I shrink down this snail. And I'm constraining the proportions right now. I'm actually going to turn that off. That will let me, oh no, it's still doing it. Oh, that's aggravating. It'll let me shrink it down. I have a setting in here somewhere that's locked these two together, but we'll deal with that later. And now I'll do the same to the snail with the mask background, Control T. And shrink it down. So they're super tiny, right? Super tiny snails. Well, let's bring them back from this tiny world. I'm going to do Control T again. Oh, well, that's a problem. Look at that pixelation. Well, I know Photoshop will clean it up once I get going, so I don't have to worry too much, right? That's not the best, right? It's damaged now. It's lost a lot of data. See, the mask is now also damaged. If we were to take a look at it, it's all blurry and pixelated and disgusting, and the snail's in the same state. So what happens if we do the smart snail? Well, this is interesting. Smart snail is fine. So what's happening is this. The destructive transform that occurred on the standard layer simply got rid of pixels when I shrank it down. If I had, like, say 500 by 500 pixels, and I shrink it down to a tenth of what it was, down to 50 by 50 pixels, and then I applied that transformation, those 450 other pixels are gone. They're destroyed. There's no getting them back. That's the end of it. When I bring it back up to 500 by 500 pixels, it's having to just guess and fill those in. And it does a pretty amazing job, but at that much of a loss, it's destroyed. There's just no coming back. So what's the deal with the smart object? Well, if we double click it, we never actually affected the original snail, the smart snail.psb that's in there. What we did was we did a transformation off of that data. And notice that I'm at 40% here, 40-ish%. If I do a transformation on the not smart snail, I can get it down to also about 40%. Now I'm claiming that on, and I'm just control clicking to move between these two layers. If I had the auto select, I could just click on them and they go normally, but I prefer leaving auto select off, using control key for when I need to select things. Anyway, if I come back to the dumb snail, poor dumb snail, and do the transformation again, you can see that this is all the data that's there, and it's at 100% by 100%. If I go to the smart snail and I do the transformation, Control T, again, it remembers that it's 40% by 40% because you're reapplying the 40% by 40% transformation to that smart snail PSB, to what is encapsulated. Every time you do a transformation on this instance of the object, it will simply go, okay, let me recalculate that off the base. So I'm not actually expanding some tiny snail up to a larger snail. I'm going back to the original large snail, and I'm saying, instead of shrinking it down to 40%, shrink it down to like 90% here. And if I come back later with another Control T, it goes, oh yeah, you had 90% of the original. How much do you want now? And you can adjust it. So in other words, the smart layer contains the transformation information on that is applied to the smart object inside of it. Or, well, I've said that a little oddly, since apparently now they're all called smart objects, so I'm not sure how to get around that. But this layer that is a smart object, any transformation is stored in here and applied on here. Now this is where it gets a little tricky. The thing that we're looking at now is the preview, and it's stored inside of this untitled 1 document. Now, this distinction matters because if you have a linked smart object, we'll talk about those later, and you lose your linked file, you'll still at least have this. You won't have the large smart object at that point, but you'll still have at least something to see. And so we'll talk about linked at the end of this. But until then, since we're working with embedded smart objects, and notice this little icon, that means an embedded smart object. If you were to link one, it would have a tiny link. I'll just show you one now. I will go up to File and Place Linked, and I'll just do the PNG, the snail with no background. And when I hit OK, notice that it has a link here instead of the smart object. Double clicking it is actually going to that PNG file that's on my desktop and opening it. This isn't a new file altogether, it's the original one. So that's very dangerous. We'll deal with that later. I'll talk about that. The important part is you'll want to deal with embedded smart objects, not linked ones for this class. Okay, so destructive transformations are actually just an application on the original thing. So you're safe. You've protected this from so much. But there's more than that. If we were to go over and apply a filter, such as the blur, and we did my favorite blur, the Gaussian blur, and I just blur the heck out of it and tell it okay, notice that it now has a smart filter with the Gaussian blur, and it has a parameters icon. If I click on that, double click on that, it brings up the blending options. Now here, I can go in and I can change modes and things like that, and I can tell it cancel. If I go here and double click the Gaussian blur itself instead of the parameters, the options, it will bring up the Gaussian blur dialog again, and it's reversible. I could bring it back down. If I don't like it at all, I can even get rid of it. If I drag the Gaussian blur to this trash can, boop, it's gone. And since it was the only smart filter being applied to the smart object, this just goes back to being a standard smart object with nothing going on. Now, if I were to go over to the snail with the background, the masked background, there we go, and I were to apply a filter blur, Gaussian blur, and just crank it all the way up, tell it okay, there's no coming back from that. If it's your last step, you can do stuff like edit undo, or you can do a fade Gaussian blur, which allows you to reverse the previous step in history. But if you were to say do that twice with a filter blur Gaussian blur again, if I were to fade this back, it's still blurry because the previous step was still blurry. If I were to save and close this, the history would be gone, and I wouldn't be able to even step back from before the blur, which means that it's just permanently applied forever, and there's nothing you can do about it. But with this beautiful, beautiful smart object, well, I can just keep applying filters as much as I want. So I could, for example, do a pixelate and crystallize. And then I could make really big cells, tell it okay, and then I could do another thing. I could do a filter, and I could do a sharpen, and I could do a sharpen edges. And that doesn't do too much to this because it's been crystallized. So let's do something a little more impressive, like maybe stylize oil paint, which is a pretty amazing process. It's essentially, we'll talk more about this later, but when we go over filters in depth, but it's a way of creating oil paint-like effects. And it's still doing that. Okay, there we go. It's rendered out. So you can see that each of these is in its own little snell cell. Haha. But if we were to do something like a filter and do a blur and a Gaussian blur, too much, we'll blur down the oil paint effect. Now here's something amazing. On the smart filter, we have these, on the smart object, we have the stack of smart filters now. And as before, we have blending options that can come in, but notice smart filters stacked on top of this filter will not preview while this filter is being edited. They'll be applied after committing the filter parameters dialog. So in other words, we bring up the dialog and we do some changes. We won't see the preview until we go in. So if I crank up the scale a little bit, if we go in and we hit OK, it will do it, but it's still all blurry. You can do this. So we can adjust the stack itself, the order of the stack. So what if I wanted the Gaussian blur to happen after crystallize before oil paint? Not a problem. Boom, done. What if I wanted to crystallize after oil paint? Well, you got to drag it all the way up Do that. So now, what if I don't want crystal ice? I've just got this Bob Ross snail happening. I think I do want crystallized, but I think I want Gaussian blur crystallized oil paint. Boom, not a problem. Now you also have the smart filter mask. So if I were to come in here with a brush, this will behave exactly like a normal mask. What if I want just the shell to be affected? Well, not a problem. I just mask out the smart filter, except around where the shell is. And then you can mask stuff back in because this is also non-destructive. So now this snail will be the belle of the ball with its amazing snail shell. Check that out. It was fully adjustable. Nothing was destroyed. How incredible is that? Now there is a downside to this. The smart filter only has one mask to share between all of them. If you wanted to apply this multiple times, you could keep encapsulating this by converting it to another smart object. And now you can apply more smart filters on top of it. If I were to do a filter pixelate facet this time, which did nothing. Go ahead and get rid of that. We'll do a filter, stylize, emboss. There we go. And I'm like, okay, I only want the emboss to apply outside of the snail shell. I'd really like to get to that snail mask and flip it around, snail shell's mask and flip it around. Well, it's all encapsulated. Go into the smart snail, and look, here it is. It's all the filters we've applied with the filter mask. We could go in one level deeper, and look, it's our snail. If we do edits to this, we need to save it and close it. I'm just going to close it with Control W. I'm just going to come back here, Control click on the smart filter. Whoops. My bad. Go in here, Control click on the smart filter, get the marquee tool, grab the selection, move it up to the snail here, and drop it in. Whoops. And then voila, line it back up, and I've just transported this this mask that I've created. So I can come over here, fill it, if I might. There we go. Alt click on the layer and then fill it. Oh, I lost it. It's terrible of me. Try to show you guys this really cool trick, and instead I lost where I was. There we go. So try this again. Go on to the smart filter, fill it. There we go. Control D to deselect. Go into it. I'm just going to alt click and invert it. Then click back up one. Ooh, now it's only applying to the snail shell. But I actually want the opposite. I wasn't paying enough attention. I'll do this. I'll invert it again. So now I have the embossed snail, the fancy snail shell, and I have all that as a number of smart objects. I find this to be a little too confusing. I'd probably approach it a different way. I just wanted to show you that it's possible to not only filter a smart object and create a smart filter, but it's possible to mask the smart filter. It's possible to encapsulate smart objects inside of other smart objects. So you can keep going all the way down, and you can produce effects like this, which I think is pretty cool. I'm just going to save this real quick as the smart snail demo. Now there's more you can do with this regarding replacing embedded objects with other objects, and I'll show you that in the next video.